There are two scripture readings today. The first one comes from Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." The second reading comes from Psalm 22, verses 1 and 2, and then also verses 11 through 15. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls encircle me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. The word of God for the people of God.
Last week, we began our series on wilderness. We listened to the story of Jesus in the wilderness at the beginning of his adult ministry, and we talked about types of wilderness experiences, the times that stretch us, the ones where we're often vulnerable, waiting for healing or hope to manifest in our stories. We talked some about how wilderness times are often lonely and isolating, which can push us to lean on God more and more for direction, support, and hope. This week, we're continuing to talk about wilderness experiences by focusing on the wilderness experience of the scriptures, the Exodus. This is one of those stories that plays a fairly pivotal role in the story of the Israelite people. And for me, it's important that we make sure we're sort of oriented around key elements and people and pieces. So I'm going to make some broad strokes, do some big history, cover about 25 chapters of scripture. All in the normal time frame. It's all right. You'll still make it to lunch on time. Historically speaking, in the Bible, we begin the Israelite family with Abraham and Sarah, the original couple, and then their son Isaac, who married Rebekah, and their sons Jacob and Esau. Those boys have a messy story all their own, and we generally end up following only that of Jacob, who married sisters, Rachel and Leah. And between them, they had 12 sons. In his story of faith, Jacob wrestles with God and is given a new name. Israel. Yep, say it boldly. We're doing our Sunday school history here, so there's going to be lots of answers that you can offer up. So Jacob wrestles with God, is given a new name, Israel, and the names of his sons become known as the 12 tribes of Israel, the Jewish people who we study throughout the scriptures. Of the 12 tribes, or rather the 12 sons, there's a good bit of jealousy and infighting, generally between those born to Rachel versus those born to Leah, who was the preferred wife, and among them, the favorite son was known to be Joseph, who was ultimately betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery in Egypt. It actually worked out fairly well for Joseph because he was liked by Pharaoh. He worked hard and he helped Egypt to prepare for a coming drought and hence a famine. So instead of using all their resources, he advised the Pharaoh to stockpile and store up so that there would be enough for the people when the famine happened. And lo and behold, all of those things came to pass. Egypt had enough in the midst of the famine, and from Joseph's family, he heard they were not doing so well. But Joseph had been so faithful and loyal to Pharaoh that Pharaoh was willing to help his family. And so they were invited to their own section of the land, given Goshen for themselves, offered the food to survive the drought and the famine. In that time, the relationship with Egypt is solid and good. All of Joseph's family moves to Egypt. They settle in, they marry, they have families, and they become a significant population. That's how they're titled in the Old Testament, a significant population. Ultimately, Joseph and his brothers, their entire generation, die naturally of old age, but the younger generations persist. And then it's not long before things shift and the relationship with Egypt tanks. Now there's a new Pharaoh in Egypt, and this Pharaoh was not at all helped by Joseph. He doesn't really care about him or his family or the history of the Israelites. This Pharaoh decides there's too many of them, they're a problem, and so something must be done. So he enslaves them. Exodus 1 tells us, the Egyptians made the Israelites' lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. In this time, Pharaoh also ordered the baby boys to be killed. A storyline we hear again in the New Testament with the birth of Jesus, one that sort of casts the light of the familiar family lore onto the new Israelite leader. But before there was Jesus, there was Moses. Moses was an Israelite born in the era when the Israelite babies were to be killed. But he was saved by his mother and protected by Pharaoh's daughter, who raised him as her own son. And then the story fast forwards to when Moses is a man. The Israelites are enslaved in Egypt and things are getting worse and worse. Slave conditions are awful, the people are miserable, and so they pray to God for help. Exodus 2 tells us that during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. At this point, I'll just say it really is worth reading Exodus. There's a lot of good stories in there, a lot of familiar characters, a little part of the history that you will probably resonate with. I'd even recommend reading Genesis as the preamble to it. By the time you get to Leviticus, you can put it all down. Genesis and Exodus, you'll know those folks, the creation stories, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and the rich Israelite history that is the foundation of our faith. We're doing the windshield tour at hyperspeed, I get that. So dig in your own time. I think you'll enjoy the stories that are there. Where we are in the story today is about the place of Moses' call, where God speaks to him at the burning bush. God called Moses where? At the burning bush. You're there. Come on, guys. We're good. All right. So God calls Moses at the burning bush, says, you're going to go and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Yep, Sunday school's right, just a couple years ago. So Moses at first protests. Eventually he says yes with the help of his brother Aaron. They go to Pharaoh, and we see the story of the plagues. How many? There it is, 10 plagues. 10 plagues before the Israelites are able to flee Egypt. They go across the Red Sea, which is actually a misnomer. It's not red at all. It's actually the Reed Sea, the Sea of Reeds. It's reedy, not red. They go across the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, toward the promised land that is flowing with milk and honey. You see, you've got this. Only GPS in those days was awful, and there was no map from there to there, and so there was a lot of wandering in the deserts. And as you can imagine, wandering in the desert without much in terms of resources was not a pleasant day trip. It held a lot of grumbling. Finally, we get to today's passage. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, basically between west and east in the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." Here we are at the classic hiking moment. I am tired, I am hungry, I am thirsty, and why did we have to do this at all? Only these people are on the 15th day of the second month since leaving Egypt. 45 days of this nonsense, and they're not just grumbly, they are desperate. They're so weary that they can only look back on what was and see the glossy version. We had pots of meat and bread. Oh, the bread. More bread than we could eat. We ate our fill and then some. Never mind the slavery and the beatings, the long hot days and the harsh conditions, the lack of freedom. No one cares about those things anyway. At least we had food. So much good food. All right, I know that was a long lead up, but here we are. The big overview of the Israelite story helps us have a framework for where we are in the story today. Specifically, that the Israelites as a people had memories of how good life in Egypt was. Remember, when they first went, it was a time of drought and famine, and there were not enough resources to feed the people or the animals. People and animals were dying. But because of their great uncle Joseph and his wisdom to store up the reserves in Egypt, his family was cared for. They were invited in and received rations for themselves and their livestock. Egypt was a place of good and plenty and resources, one of compassion and sharing. Egypt was good. Pharaoh was good. The Egyptians were good until they got a new leader who was hard-hearted and politically motivated. That Pharaoh did not want to be sharing with the foreigners, and so he cut them off, at least as their share was considered, enslaved them, and Egypt became a very bitter place. One of heat and hard work, of beatings and minimal resources. Egypt became so bad that the people only wanted to leave. In their minds, redemption was lost. God heard their prayers and prepared and provided a leader for them in Moses, and God reoriented them to a new place and a new chapter for their future. And so today, here they are on their way to that new place, that new future, that new promise, with no idea how long it was going to take to get there. And they are not happy about it. I mean, they wanted the promised land. They wanted the milk and honey. They wanted the freedom, the goodness, the property, the possibilities. Who wouldn't? But they did not want the desert in between. The desert in between is the wilderness. It's the liminal place between there and there. The time between the place we wanted to leave and the place we hope to reestablish ourselves. The wilderness is the place of wandering, of grumbling, of discomfort and discontentment. It's the time where it's easy to get unhappy and then nostalgic, glossing over the pain or the suffering of what was and imagining it really wasn't that bad. The wilderness can be a time of sugarcoating, where we only highlight the goodness of what was, burying all the things that were bitter and awful. And it can be this place of intense yearning for stability, for familiarity, for being grounded and rooted in the midst of uncertainty. We just want to brush with that which reminds us that life is good, that there's peace, that there's joy, that there's possibility. Some of us, personally, have the good gift of being able to look back and remember the good times, the good people, the good places. There once was a time where we could run free. We could trust our neighbors. We could engage in political discussions and not be torn apart by them. There was a time when we didn't worry about gun violence in our schools or the burning down of our planet. There were good times, great times. Some of us would like to go back to those times. Others of us don't have that same gift. We look back and our story is one of pain and hardship through and through. And so instead of looking back, we look ahead, we daydream about the possibilities, the potential, what there could be out there, and we imagine all that God might do for us and through us. We plead with God to see us, to help us, to save us. And it's in those moments that the words of the psalmist ring most true. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning. My God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. I'm poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It's melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue, it sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. The wilderness can be pretty harsh. It can feel like you might never escape it. And when you fear that it might be where your story ends, it's easy to wish you'd never even ventured out. But I promise, the wilderness isn't always bad. It's not all hardship and yearning and grumbling. In the waiting and that vulnerability, there's a sensitivity to God, a readiness to hear from God, and a proclivity to actually listen. In the yearning, in the remembering, there's a space to recall what God has done. We hear that in the words of the psalm that were not read this morning. I want to share some of those with you now, remembering that the psalm was written after the time of the Exodus. So the faithfulness that is remembered is that of the Israelites in the desert. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. The psalmist knows there's more to the story. God has shown up before. And as those who came before suffered, so too were they delivered. God heard their suffering and responded. Telling their story offers hope in the midst of our story. It's good to remember it is not all about us. There were people before, and there will be people who come after, and God has been showing up for each one along the way. The psalmist points us even to our beginning, saying, "You brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God." The psalmist reminds us God has been with us, holding us, looking out for us, watching over us from the very beginning. And God will be present to the very end. The psalmist pushes us to a place of hope in the future where things will be restored and resolved, and says, "All the rich of the earth will feast and worship. All who go down to the dust will kneel before the Lord. Those who cannot keep themselves alive. Posterity will serve the Lord. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim God's righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, God has done it." The psalmist knows about the wilderness, knows about the yearning and the seeking and the looking back and the remembering and the pleading and the crying out. And the psalmist knows that's not it. Not all of it anyway. There's a story that comes before and there's a story that comes after, and God is there from beginning to end. My friends, some of us are in the midst of the wilderness. We're hurting. We're struggling. We're waiting. We're pleading. We're looking back and remembering, longing for what was. And some of us are desperate for that next chapter. To each of you, I say you are not alone. You are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Witnesses who can share their stories, the ways that God has blessed them and been present with them and for them. And not just us, but each generation. And for us and in us and through us, there is a future of promise. Wilderness can be brutal and harsh and lonely. There is no denying that. And if you're there for today, take just one step, one at a time, as much as you can do. And if you're not there, thank God, and be present with those who are. I want to invite us to offer a reminder to one another today. You are not alone. And this is not the only part of your story. Whether you're in the part of the wilderness or whether you are far beyond it, you are not alone. And this is not the only part of your story. I would invite you to turn to those near you, next to you, in front of you, or behind you. See them. I know some of you were hoping to escape it. It's okay. You'll survive it. See your neighbor. Tell them you are not alone. And this is not the only part of your story.